Welcome to CESTA. First time here? I'm Ali Aycıoğlu, professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern History here in the History Department. And this quarter, I'm honored to serve as the faculty host in the absence of Joanna, our real faculty director of CESTA. So I'm just guarding CESTA against the dragons this quarter. So it's our privilege to host Professor Nicolas Tackett today. Professor Tackett is a scholar of Chinese history at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Tackett holds degrees from Stanford in biology and PhD in Columbia in Chinese history. At UC Berkeley, he teaches courses on pre-modern China and global history. He's a specialist in the history of China during the Tang, Song, and Liao dynasties from 7th to 13th centuries. Professor Tackett has made significant contribution to understanding the social, political, and cultural transformation of this era. His research focuses on the demise of the medieval aristocracy, the rise of the Chinese meritocracy in the 9th and 11th centuries, and the development of Chinese nationalism during the 11th century. Employing both textual and archaeological material, he has pioneered the integration of digital tools into historical research. Tackett's first book, The Destruction of the Medieval Chinese Aristocracy, many of you probably know this very well, examines the survival and eventual disappearance of the great aristocratic families that dominated the political landscape in China during much of the first millennium. Second book, The Origins of the Chinese Nation, Song, China, and the Origin of an East Asian World Order, explores the emergence of a national consciousness among Chinese educated elite in the 11th century. Both works demonstrate the transformative potential to digital methodologies in historical studies, drawing an extensive biographical and prosopographical, biographical and geographical database. So Professor Tackett's current project, The Rise of the Chinese Meritocracy, the transformation of the elite culture in the 10th century China, which is also Professor full dissertation, as I get it, explores how the destruction of the medieval aristocracy led to the rise of an ethos that prioritized merit over bloodlines. The cultural shift, driven in part by extensive migrations during the 10th century, paved the way for the civil service examination system to become the primary avenue for bureaucratic recruitment by the 11th century. Today, Professor Tackett will share insights from his research in a talk titled The Medieval Transformation of Chinese Elite Society in Data. The data is in red. In this presentation, he will propose new ways to characterize the transformation of the elite society in pre-modern China, using diverse data sources such as prosopographic, geographic, and textual databases, alongside innovative digital methodologies. His talk promises to offer fascinating exploration to how digital tools and textual analysis, archaeological material can illuminate the social, political, and cultural values of China. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Nicolas Tackett.
Thank you very much, and thank everyone for coming to listen to my talk. I'm always very pleased to come to Stanford. As was explained, I was an undergrad here 25 years ago. And this campus is just always cheers me up. Okay, so the topic I want to discuss today revisits a classic question of Chinese historiography, and that is the question of the transformation of the elite in medieval China. This revolves around a an old thesis, over 100 years old, the idea of the Tang Song transition, one key component of which was the demise of the medieval aristocracy and the rise of a new elite that is often described as more meritocratic, that depended more on the civil service exams rather than on the pedigree to define their status. Now, what I want to do today is to think about alternative ways of characterizing this transformation. I don't want to, my interest is not in calling into question the fundamental ideas that have become, part of textbook accounts of this period, but my interest is to sort of look into more detail and to examine some of the conclusions one might come up with by looking at large data sets. My book project, as was suggested, is going to focus really on the mechanisms to explain this transformation, and the book will focus on the 10th century. But here I don't want to dwell on the 10th century, and I want to instead look at the big picture and talk about some of the characteristics of this transformation. One of the key source materials I will refer to is well known to historians of China, and that is the funerary epitaphs, the Mu Zhi. These are biographies carved onto large slabs of limestone, some of which are depicted here. We can see some of these. These are going to be mostly 8th and 9th century funerary epitaphs. And these biographies are often several hundred words in length, sometimes well over 1,000 words in length. They're pretty lengthy biographies. They have quite a bit of interesting material, and they've also been discovered in tremendous numbers. Tens of thousands of these have been found from the second half of the first millennium and into the second millennium. So there's a huge number of these biographies, and they really allow one to dig much deeper into society as compared to some of the traditional biographical sources that have been used by generations of historians. These epitaphs give good genealogic data that complements some of the data that exists in other sources. They also offer spatial data, marriage data, and also eulogistic language that can be analyzed and be used productively in research. And so the basic idea is that over the past 20 years, I've been working on a large database that pulls in this material from these various sources. So here we see the genealogic data. We have 3 individuals, the son, the father, and the grandfather, and one can see how this can be reconstructed on the basis of a fairly short, this is a pretty short example of a funerary biography. Most of the ones that I look at are quite a bit longer, but it's useful for illustrative purposes. And then here is an example of pulling out the data relating to place of death, burial site, and also ancestral place. This is also the sort of information that one typically finds in these funerary biographies. Now, on the basis of this, I want to comment on 5 specific topics that I think are central to what I want to discuss today, that is the ways of characterizing this transformation in Chinese society. The first revolves around family office holding traditions. So there was a fundamental change in office holding traditions of elite families, that is, of families that provided individuals who served in the imperial bureaucracy. these families looked very different in the earlier Tang period as compared to the later Song period. Now, to do this, basically, I reconstructed very large numbers of these family trees, which I refer to as patrilines in my first book. These are basically descent lines going along the patriline from father to son. So it's easy to fill in data. This is exactly how it is preserved in Chinese sources. So it fits right into the database. In this particular case, I might give one example of such a patriline, which consists of descendants of a certain Wei Quan, who's not particularly well known, but he produced a number of his descendants would end up serving in the Tang imperial bureaucracy. What this family tree depicts, so first you have this Wei Quan at the top. All of these circles are going to be, for the most part, office holders in the imperial bureaucracy. And then the triangles, this is a code I was using. This refers to the place. So these are all represent individuals whose funerary epitaphs have been discovered, and we can know where they were buried. In this case, the triangle indicates Chang'an, which is the western capital of the Tang dynasty. There were two capitals of the Tang dynasty, the western and the eastern. The western was the more important capital, and this is where this particular family was evidently based. Now, what I did was, in my database, using my database, one can reconstruct very large numbers of these patrilines and then use this data for various purposes, one of which is then to identify the office holding traditions of various individuals. So in this chart, I'm suggesting one of the conclusions one can draw from this data, and that is to see in very stark terms how the office holding traditions of chief ministers, of the most prominent ministers of the imperial government, changed between the Tang and the Song. In the Tang period, in the earlier period, one finds that most chief ministers, one can reconstruct their ancestries and trace them back to the pre-Tang period or even the pre-Sui period. So we're talking about several, 300 years, let's say. By the 9th century, we can trace these people's ancestors. Basically every generation, or nearly every generation, serving in office going back to the 6th century at least. And so this is a very good illustration of the power that these particular families had. These families of office holders were able to control the bureaucracy at the very highest levels. By the time you get to the Song, one can argue that the possibility existed for a new aristocracy to emerge, but at the minimum, one is forced to recognize that the people by the late 10th century were a completely different group of people. These were no longer the same families. Those families from that had dominated the bureaucracy for a good chunk of the first millennium really disappeared from the political scene by the end of the 10th century. What else can one say about this transformation? This transformation of medieval Chinese elites also entailed a change in the geographic distribution of political power. So in this case, I use, once again, the same basic data, and I compare, in this case, the families that produced chief ministers. Actually, for the Tang, I look at the families that produced chief ministers. For the Song, I look at the families that produced members of the Council of State, that is, the individuals, not just the chief ministers, but a few other individuals who met with the emperor on a daily basis. These were people who had particular strong influence on policymaking. And the reason the sample is defined somewhat differently is just because because that's the data I collected. I think it suggests more or less the same. It represents the same basic sort of person, that is the people with policymaking influence. And so the idea is then to look at where these families were based in the earlier period versus the later period. And in this case, I compare the late Tang, so prior to this transformation, and I compare that to the second half of the Song dynasty, the southern Song, after the Song lost its northern half. And here, once again, one can make out an interesting pattern, an interesting change. So on this map, what I've done is basically the circles represent places of burial, and of course the larger circles represent larger numbers of burials. The pluses represent where family members served in office. So we're not just looking at the chief ministers themselves, we're looking at everyone within the patriline of the chief ministers. And so one can see in the Tang, they served basically all over the empire, but they were very much based in the capital. This is where they were buried. There is, for people who do Tang history, there is a problem, a historiographic issue, which is that the Tang great families claimed an ancestral place in the provinces, and very often people will conclude this is where they were actually from, but that's not true. They were based in the capital. It's very clear when one looks at burial data, highly centralized. If one looks, and what I did also is I shaded in this area here, which represents the prefectures around the two capitals, so the capital, the western capital, the eastern capital, the two capitals, and then this corridor linking these two capitals together. This is where a very substantial percentage of these families were based. And by contrast, when we get to the second half of the Song period, the capital of the southern Song was located here. There's a little star here. And one can see that the families were spread out a bit more. They continued to serve all over the empire. Some of them served in the north. This would be a relic, it'd basically be family members that had served prior to the loss of the north. But you can basically see that, again, they served all over the empire. They did not live all over the empire, but they were still much more, they covered a greater geographic range than what you see in the Tang dynasty. And what's interesting then is if one overlays this on top of a map of population, basically the registered population, one can see that all of the most populous prefectures of the empire are in fact, one might say, represented in the bureaucracy. Another way of putting it is you could basically say that the families that produced the top officials by the Southern Song were not just based in the capital, but they were spread out throughout the most populous parts of the empire. And one can even go a step further and come up with a metric to measure, basically what is the population, the registered population in the region that where you have these families that produce chief ministers where they're based. This is a region I refer to in one of my articles as the metropole, and one can see that in the Tang, just an eighth of the population of the registered population inhabited the region that was, again, inhabited by these imperial elites. But by the time you get to the Southern Song, over half of the population of the registered population lives in, again, regions where the local elites would occasionally produce some of the top ministers in the bureaucracy. So this is the second, I think, important component of this medieval transformation. It's one of these components that I think is very important, very significant, but perhaps a bit de-emphasized when one talks about the Tang Song transition. Next, I want to make some comments on the structure of the elite marriage network. So in this case, one is not just looking at the patriline data and the burials of members of the patrilines. One is looking at marriage ties between patrilines. So here is a depiction of the situation in the Tang dynasty. Basically, each of these circles now, or each of the figures represents a patriline, so an entire multi-generational extended family, rather than an individual. So earlier diagram of a family tree that I showed, the figures represented individuals. Here they represent patrilines. And basically, the letters indicate either Chang'an, the western capital, or Luoyang, the eastern capital. And you can see that these families that dominated the bureaucracy were very much based in the capital region. We already know this from other data. But one can also identify an interesting structure to the marriage network. You can make out two principal elements. One involves marriages between a variety of different families and the imperial clan. So it's a network organized around the imperial clan and mostly based in the western capital, or to some extent between involving families situated in the vicinity of both capitals. By contrast, there's another network that is somewhat removed from this marriage network with the imperial clan, and that consists of what are actually the most eminent families. These were the families that were referred to as marriage ban clans because they were supposed to not intermarry. They had become so, marriages with these families had become such a status symbol that the emperor tried, early in the Tang dynasty, tried to forbid them from intermarrying. Of course, this simply encouraged them, increased their value on the marriage market. And so one sees the result was a very tightly knit marriage network between these most eminent families that was situated somewhat removed from the marriage network involving the imperial clan. This is the situation throughout most of the Tang dynasty into the 9th century. So again, we're talking about the same old families based in the capital and organized in these two interrelated networks. Now, by the time you get to the Song, the situation is somewhat different. One can still make out the marriages with the imperial clan. That features very prominently, but one sees that there is no alternative now. There is no group of families, no network of families that competes with the imperial clan in terms of influence over the political elite. One can make out within this network a number of families marked in these red dots here, which I refer to here as patriline marriage cluster A. And basically what this consists of are families that in the interregnum between the Tang and the Song, these were the families of the provincial governors. They were basically people who the families began, the founder of the family would have been an entrenched warlord who was absorbed into some of the nascent regimes of the 10th century. And if they played their politics right, they would survive the interregnum to the Song dynasty. And they really constituted the core of, or their descendants constituted the core of the new Song marriage network, as one can see here. Besides that, another interesting characteristic of this network that one can sort of make out on this diagram is that it also brought together different regional elites. So between the Tang and the Song, during a period of political fragmentation, there were a number of competing regimes, each of which had their own strongly centralized states with bureaucracies modeled after the Tang bureaucracy with an elite modeled after the Tang elite. And when they were brought together with Song reunification in the period between 960 and 980, what you see is basically a number of these regional networks marked in different colors that were sort of brought together into this new network. So I think that there's some interesting and important differences between the Song case and the Tang case. First and foremost is the disappearance of any alternative to the imperial clan, but also there is, at least initially, the representation of a number of different regional elites. And one can also, again, make out the core component, which consists of these new families, the warlords of the 10th century. Let me now turn to a somewhat different topic, and this is to look at the language within epitaphs that celebrated the deceased. So of course, you can imagine that every deceased is celebrated, no matter what kind of person the individual actually was. And what's interesting then is to analyze on what grounds this person is celebrated, what makes them, what gives them prestige in their particular society. And one can recognize, in fact, a pretty substantial change in the language. So what I did was I basically took the texts of a very large number of these epitaphs. So the epitaphs, initially I tried to simply isolate the eulogistic language and exclude some of the other language about genealogy, etc. But I ended up finding that this was just too much work, and it was in fact unnecessary. You could just take the text of the whole epitaph and just analyze that and look for changes in language. And what I ended up doing, I played around with different strategies, but I ended up just doing word counts, basically. And the idea is to look for words that appear much more commonly in the early epitaphs or much more commonly in the late epitaphs. So there were three periods, 7th century, 9th century, and 11th century that I looked at. I took a huge number of texts, thousands of these texts, and just wrote a Python script or a series of Python scripts that just compared the language and produced these lengthy word lists. And then I did two things with that. One was to analyze this these word lists, and that I did in a much more subjective manner. I just looked at the words and tried to figure out, come up with an explanation on my own. And the second thing I did was to then, graph the changes in the language over time. People who have, who are experts of Chinese literature will, of course, recognize that the Guwen movement of the 11th century features very prominently, plays an important role in this. So there is a literary movement that explains some of this change in language. I do think, however, that one should, and this might be a contentious claim, that one should also take the changes in language literally and try to read the changes in vocabulary as possessing some sort of meaning. So here, the words are irrelevant, but the idea is just to illustrate this approach of counting the appearance of words in different epitaphs. I also used regular expressions, so combinations of closely related words. And then I tried to come up with the first set of conclusions involved my interpretation of this change in language. It seems to me that in the older discourse, if you look at the words that feature much more commonly in the earlier epitaphs, one can make out what one might call a discourse that embodies an aristocratic ethos. One can recognize language related to just talking about family tradition. One can recognize language. I find this very interesting, this botanical language that is used to talk about the descendants of the ancestors as being particularly, fruitful, and it's just lots and lots of descendants. The ancestors had lots and lots of descendants. This was evident of heaven's favor, let's say, on the family. There's also discussion less about accomplishments than about bearing, than about physical appearance. For example, rather than talking about in explicit terms, the accomplishments in the bureaucracy, there's a reference to the clothing of the bureaucrats. So there's more emphasis on the physical appearance, on the body, rather than on the achievements. There is a discussion of excellence, and some of these words conveying this idea of excellence suggest, emanating brilliance, as in, which can also mean light, very luminous. And one can see in this, a suggestion that there's this aura that just emanates from this, from these individuals. Something you can't help but notice. You're in their presence and you're in awe at them. This is the ideas that are being conveyed here. So again, less about the actual accomplishments than about this idea of this eminence, of this emanating brilliant excellence. There is discussion of natural endowment as well. And then there's discussions of these epitaphs of the earlier period, often referred to the genealogies, the family genealogies. They talk about, they clearly articulate ideas of the ranking of clans. They talk about top-ranked clans. Of course, the clan of the deceased is always a top-ranked clan, but the point is, again, that there's this interest in this ranking of families, and this make out this language, laudatory language of these epitaphs. When we get to the new language, the discourse in the later epitaphs, this, it seems to me, can be read as representing a more meritocratic ethos. The idea is, in my view, the elites are always find ways to remain and to keep their status. They find ways to survive, and part of the ways they find to survive involves, articulating what makes these families special. In the Tang period, we see this articulation of an aristocratic ethos as a way to justify the survival of these families. And in the Song, one sees a different language, a language that focuses on education, a language that focuses on, there's much more reference to literary output, sort of the cultural accomplishments of these individuals. There's also a specific term, shidafu, that one finds rarely in Tang epitaphs. One does find this term with other, it's kind of a part of a 4-character compound in the earlier period, but it appears as 3 characters in the later period. This is simply a term that is often, it is a term that is often left untranslated in English. One just talks about the shidafu. Well, it'll come back. I evidently stepped on it. Anyways, so shidafu is usually left untranslated into English. It's a term that could be translated as, I don't know, literati of or something like that. But I think it's interesting more as possibly a term of self-identity, just a term to describe who we are as elites in a song, as distinct from the elites of the Tang. So it's interesting that this term indeed shows up more frequently in the later times. And then for those of you who are familiar with Beverly Foster's account of this from the book published in the 90s, where she was also looking at epitaphs, one can recognize some of the themes there that she talks about. More interest in talking about grandchildren, so about the descendants rather than the ancestors, and then discussion of household management, of instruction of children, and then also more discussion of financial matters, of wealth and poverty. So we can recognize some distinct differences in how people are celebrated in the earlier period versus the later period. Now, the next step, I looked at the, I basically just graphed this out, because the other thing that's cool about epitaphs as opposed to other types of text is that they can be dated very precisely, and they cover kind of a great range of time periods. You're not forced to just look at certain key moments in time. You can really see how things evolve over time. You can map this out. I classified the epitaphs into different sorts. So one are epitaphs discovered in Henan. Basically, the vast majority of these are in the vicinity of Luoyang. Luoyang was the eastern capital of the Tang, and then it was the western capital of the Song. So it was continuously a capital city, and it was a locus where political elites aggregated, or cultural elites aggregated. So that's what makes this place interesting. Luzhou is a backwater place. It's not that far from Luoyang, but it's on the other side of the Yellow River, on the other side of a mountain range. And that, I picked Luzhou because a huge number of epitaphs have been discovered there, just by coincidence. They show up all the time. And so you can compare the epitaphs produced. So these are all excavated epitaphs, and you can compare the ones produced by, let's say, a cultural elite versus those produced by people who are a little more further removed from the center of action. And then I also include epitaphs contained in literary collections, so Wenji in the literary collections. And these, I imagine to be a very particular type of text. These are the texts that are, become the focus in later times. People, when they think of the tomb epitaphs of the Tang period, they often think of what's contained in the literary text as has gotten the most attention over the years, but they're not necessarily characteristic of the broader capital-based cultural elite. So what one sees here is the change in the average number of old terms per 1,000 characters. And what you basically see, in, as I read it, is a gradual decline over time in this older language that would disappear, largely disappear by the second half of the 11th century. So in the capital and among the cultural elite, there was a gradual decline. However, in these provincial backwater, the older language survived a bit longer before disappearing precipitously in the middle of the 11th century. One can then look at it from the other side and look at the rise of the new language. And here I think it's quite interesting. What one sees is that there is this anomalous situation where you have the literary collections of the 9th century that indeed make use of this new language. For those of you who studied, those of you who are sinologists in the room, we're talking about mainly this is Han Yu and Du Mu. They're using this new language, but this is completely out of touch with the cultural elite of the period. Those writing the epitaphs for very prominent people in the capital did not make use of this new language in the 9th century. It was just this anomalous, these couple of writers. Now, what happens is that these writers become very popular in the 11th century, and so that's why they survive and why they are famous, but they don't represent the actual course of events. What you see is that really the new stuff doesn't really begin to take off until the turn of the 11th century. And by the, and over the course of the 11th century, you see this rapid shift towards this new language. You can see it, you can graph it out. And it's interesting then that in this second wave, you still have those who produce the surviving literary collections, they perhaps turn to this new language earlier than the rest of the capital-based elite society, but the rest of the capital-based elite society did follow soon thereafter, and it was only a couple decades after that that the provincial elites in the more far removed parts of the empire finally turned to this language. So again, what I want to suggest here is that there was this radical change in how elites talked about themselves, celebrated themselves in epitaphs, and again, one can see this happening as part of this Tang transition. The last point I want to make, and I'll make it fast because I see that we've already been talking for quite a while, and that is to talk about a change in the geographic horizon. So the idea is that one of the key shifts that happens, as I suggested before, is sort of the geographic, an expansion in the geographic scope of where the political elite is actually based. But there's also an interesting component, other facet to this, which involves how the rest of the empire was talked about in textual sources, that there is much greater attention given to more far removed parts of the empire in the surviving sources. And I see this as part of this process where you go from a very hierarchical society that's super capital centric to one that's much less hierarchical, still hierarchical, but less so, relatively speaking, which also entails a less evident hierarchy of place. So one way of seeing this, and here we are no longer going to, I'm no longer going to be talking about funerary epitaphs. I'm going to talk about other genres. One of them consists of these imperial geographies. A certain number of them were produced at various moments in China's history, basically an effort by either court organized or organized by a private scholar, an effort to basically talk about all of the places in the empire. And these imperial geographies, all of them at the minimum, they identified all of the counties and prefectures of the empire. So you do get a comprehensive view of the empire. But what I noticed that's different, that changes over time, is how much more you learn about these places beyond just that they existed. So you can have just lists of place names, but then you can also have other sites to visit, famous sites or famous mountains, various specific sites associated with these different places. And if you start looking at where does one see these, where are the places of interest of the empire, one does see a change over time. It's not, I see it as something where what happens in the 10th century basically builds off of what had been happening before. They are not forgetting the place names, the famous sites of an earlier era are still going to be famous sites in the next era. But what's interesting is that in the later era, there is an expansion of this, considerable expansion in certain key ways. So this on the left is comes from an imperial geography of the early 9th century. And what you see is, first of all, a substantial emphasis on places situated in North China, so in the vicinity of the two capitals, the Western capital and the Eastern capital, as well as some of the across some of the most important agricultural lands in the north. There is also much discussion of the region around Chengdu in the Sichuan Basin, and then maybe a little bit in the lower Yangtze River region. And then there's an interesting, we can recognize here, this interesting axis here, which is probably represents basically administrators who were traveling from the capital down to the southern port of Guangzhou. This would have been sort of a major thoroughfare. And so people were quite familiar with these places. They had talked about some of the mountains you could see or the temples you could visit along the way. And so those places made their way into this imperial geography. But there were big, gaps, exactly. Gaps in the data. Most obviously are, well, I have a couple of arrows. So this arrow indicating the eastern part of the Sichuan, eastern Sichuan, very poorly talked about in the early 9th century, kind of off the radar, off most people's radar. And then also this region here, which consists of the Gan River Valley, that is Jiangxi province today, as well as parts of the southeastern uplands. And one sees then by the 10th century, there's still, again, memory of all of these sites in the north. They still make their way into the imperial geography. There's much more stuff, however, on the lower Yangtze River. And then we also see some of these gaps filled in, the eastern Sichuan, as well as the Gan River Valley. And this, of course, represents some of the core key heartlands of some of these regimes of the interregnum. And certainly that played a role in expanding the awareness of these regions of the empire. Another source one can look at that is suggestive of something similar, even if perhaps not quite as obvious, is to look at anecdotes in this collection, the Taiping Guangji, which is basically a text that has somewhere over 7,000 little stories. They tend to be stories about extraordinary things or strange things. This is where you find stories of ghosts, stories of people who turn into foxes, all kinds of very interesting stories. They're all stories, not quite all, but the majority of these stories are not described as taking place in another world. They take place in this world. They take place in specific places. The places are identified in the stories, and you can map these out. What you find is that in the 9th century sources, so this is the map that's weighted so that if there are more stories from a particular place, it's particularly brilliant in this heat map. And you can see this incredible attention given to Chang'an, the Western capital, features very prominently in, so I took this collection and then I divided up. The collection identifies the original source of the anecdotes. You can date the original sources, and then compare the 9th century sources to the 10th century sources. I also used OpenAI to identify some of the place names. Sometimes it worked less well. But basically in the 9th century sources, there's a huge evident focus on the capital, whereas in the 10th century, there's broader attention given to other regional centers, so Chengdu, Yangzhou, and well, what would later become Nanjing. And then also some attention given to other regions of the South. If one looks, rather than at a weighted map, one looks instead at an unweighted map. So this basically identifies all places, even if mentioned in just one anecdote, and does not prioritize those mentioned more than once. One can still see that there's far more places mentioned in sort of this capital corridor between the western and eastern capital. In the cases of the 9th century anecdotes, a little bit of attention to Chengdu. One can make out this north-south axis connecting the capital to the Guangzhou, the port city in the south. By contrast, in the 10th century, less of a focus on the capital, more interest in other regions, and notably this region here of South China. One can see this sort of southward shift of attention given in these anecdotes. So this too I see as a component of this transformation of elite society, in this case reflecting the attention, the geographic focus of the individuals, which I see as representing a sort of a de-hierarchization of